My next guest is Major General Chip Chapman. He was Britain's counterterrorism chief and its senior military advisor to the US Central Command. So he can share valuable insights on what's known about IS and how intelligence on the group is gathered, as well as some thoughts on the future implications of this developing story. General, great to have you on the show. Thank you.
You're welcome, Riz.
So how much information did Western intelligence gather about the likelihood of an attack taking place in Moscow?
Well, I think first you have to understand the post-9/11 world to begin to answer that. So after 9/11, the American doctrine really was never again. And therefore, in terms of their SIGINT particularly capability, it was collect it all, know it all, and try and exploit it all. Now, intelligence is never a perfect science. And the real reason you have intelligence is to try and prevent strategic shocks. So I would say that the Americans, in terms of their warning to the Russians on the 7th of March, under the duty to warn, had enough intelligence without the specifics to tell the Russians to take cognizance of this and as a credible and serious threat. Now, it doesn't look like the Russians did that, which is why you always go through three aspects in terms of an attack when it takes place. The first one is, gosh, this is terrible, which it is. In terms of this attack, in EU type terms, this would be the second biggest land attack in terms of casualties in the recent history since the Second World War, only exceeded by the Madrid attack in 2004, where 191 were killed. The second one is who did it and why. The Russians, of course, are saying that this had a Ukrainian link. The Americans and everyone else would say it is an IS link. And to be honest, given the fact that there was first-person video shown by the attackers and the various claims from various credible media sources from IS, you would say that this is absolutely IS, given the fact that they posited this as or the messaging on this was that it was revenge on Crusader Russians. And finally, the US National Security Congress has also said that IS is the sole responsibility for this, and there is no Ukrainian involvement whatsoever. Now, what we have to be careful about is that if you then extrapolate back to the patterns of global terrorism, Russia in 2023 was very safe, and Russia in 2022 was very, very safe. There were 3 attacks in 2023, of which there were 2 deaths, 4 attacks in 2022, which were also just 2 deaths. And in Europe itself, the Global Terrorism Index would tell us that in last year was the safest year for 15 years. So you have this view that an attack is inevitable and that we've got the highest threat level since 9/11. None of that is necessarily true. It may be true in some countries. So, for example, based on, we think, specific intelligence, the French have raised their alert state to what would be the equivalent of critical in the UK. That is, an attack is imminent or due in the near future. And also there have been raises of the threat level in a number of other European countries, such as Spain, Austria, Portugal, Denmark, the Netherlands, but they are not to do with, as a response to the Moscow attack. They're a response to the chatter which has gone off since the 7th of October. And that is more likely to be the antagonist for future attacks at the moment.
All right. Well, General, many people might be surprised to learn that intelligence services share warnings like this to nations which they wouldn't necessarily consider as allies, especially considering the Western stance with Russia right now. How unusual is this practice, and in particular in this case with Russia?
Well, I don't think intelligence sharing is unusual in terms of these types of things. You know, there are certain strategic things which all nations seem to subscribe to. Non-nuclear proliferation is one, where there was cooperation with the Russians and Americans. The use of space in terms of astronauts going up, and intelligence to preempt terrorists is also another one, because it is malign activity which destabilizes all countries. So it isn't unusual at all to share this type of intelligence.
Sir, you know, the IS group is generally considered quite disparate. The idea of a central command is often questioned, and I'm wondering what we know specifically about the IS group who claimed responsibility for the Moscow attack.
Well, I think that's now been slightly downgraded. The notion that it was ISIS-K, the Khorasan branch, is, I think, unproven at the moment. Now, the Khorasan branch, of course, is the Wilayat or province, of which there are about 14 across the world. That's often something which gives them more credence than it maybe should have. That covers both the Khorasan province of Iran, and we might remember that big attack which killed 85 people a few months ago, covers Afghanistan and Pakistan. Now, whether they have an external operations capability, I think, is a different matter. We can say, I think, it is jihadist violence. Whether it was inspired by, controlled by, or decentralized to is another matter, and I don't think we've got enough fidelity of that. What we do know, though, that of the terrorist attacks in 2023, the most lethal group in 2023 was IS globally, where it killed something like 1,636 people, but that was down 17% itself from the figure of 2022. The second highest group was Hamas, really, because of 7th of October. The third, Al-Shabaab in Somalia, an AQ-linked organization. And the fourth was Janib, an Al-Qaeda linked group in West Africa, the area covering Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso. So both of the two main groups that we've really dealt with in the 21st century, Al-Qaeda and IS, are evident in the attacks of 2023. It doesn't really matter which wilayat they come from. They're still a problem in terms of their ideological beliefs for the future. And that's one of the reasons that they attacked Russia, not just because of them seeing as crusaders, but because of their violent actions, for example, in Chechnya and the Caucasus, where there is an IS presence, for example, in Ingushetia, Dagestan, and Chechnya.
Well, until the Moscow attack last week, so the threat of IS had to the general public, certainly through the media, largely disappeared from the headlines. But the group obviously has not ceased operations entirely. So I wonder, from what you know, what have they been up to since their founder, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, was killed by American forces in Syria in 2019?
Well, they still are active, but the notion of centralized control, both for Al-Qaeda in Afghanistan, AQ core, that's difficult for them. We don't even know who their leader is since Zawahiri was killed in 2022. Neither do we know really who the leader of IS core in either Syria or Iraq is these days, after the fourth iteration, 3 after Baghdadi, was taken out last year. So, and that is one of their problems in terms of centralized command and control, in that if you have to command, you need to illuminate. If you illuminate, other than sort of courier systems, things that sort of UBL was using, you're likely to be picked up by the prevalence of the intelligence agencies. So what we're really seeing more of most of the time is this leaderless jihad, and indeed the notion of what is now known as single issue terrorists, SITs, rather than lone wolves. So that's essentially what they are, lone actors. And that's also why the attack in a Western country of this scale is unusual. So, for example, in the UK, most of the attacks in the last few years, and it's now difficult for people to remember when the last attack took place, you have to really go back to sort of 5 years ago. Most of the ones which have been in the last few years in the UK, for example, and actually France and other European countries, have been bladed weapons or vehicle as a weapon. The reason for that is in a Western country which has a decent joined up security agencies, in the UK, both coming together of MI5, Counter-Terrorist Command, MI6, to have a significant plot, which this was, to kill that many people involving bombs and bullets, means that there's often significant leakage or spillage of the plot. That gives a number of opportunities to interdict that plot. Right. And the interesting thing about the Russia attack, from the sort of benchmark from the UK and largely Western perspective, is that this was sort of fidayin, shoot and scoot type terrorism, of two pairs, and two pairs goes back to the reasonable worst case that we take in the UK, which itself comes from the Mumbai attack in 2008.
So interesting, based on what you just said, how worried should people be in the West now? Do you see this as a one-off directed specifically at Russia, or would you see this as a start of a global campaign?
I don't see it as the start of a global campaign in terms of that access to bombs and bullets. What I do see post 7th of October is certainly a greater propensity for lone actor terrorism based on issue transfers mainly to do with Palestine and Gaza. That is something which should worry everyone. And Ken McCullum, the head of MI5, said quite soon after the 7th of October that terrorist attacks could be prompted by fighting between Israel and Hamas. And although we've seen a lot more hate crime and a lot more extremism, as evidenced, for example, by the number of reports to the counter-terrorist hotline, or, for example, the number of reports to the counter-terrorist internet referral unit, and indeed in attacks, hate crime attacks on either Muslims or on Jews in the UK and Europe-wide, extremism and hate crimes are different than terrorism, certainly in the definition and how violence is used in those things, as a difference from the manifestation of hate crimes in terms of either robbery or assaults, which are different than our definition of terrorism when you're going to kill people with malign intent to further your political.
It's interesting you raise that, General, because in some of the interviews recently, I've been asking whether or not there is a great risk in Israel having the narrative that this has become now a Muslim-Jewish issue in Hamas, with Hamas in Gaza, because it takes it away from the basic land dispute that exists between Israelis and Palestinians, and that it might be a cause that then spreads because it's portrayed as a Muslim-Jewish issue.
Well, all those can be true, and there can be other things on top of that. I mean, what we generally would say about terrorism is you need a grievance, you need an ideology, you need some sort of recruitment agent, and often there is a vulnerability to people who are recruited. That is why also it's been difficult in a number of cases in the UK recently to say that there have been terrorist attacks. So to give you an example, the Liverpool attack on Remembrance Day, because of the coming together of the date with someone who seemed to have a non-Western look, made people think that was terrorism. But because of the way, and because of the way there was a bomb in the car. Now, the real thing was that it was propelled by a immigration grievance and mental health challenges, in the same way that the most lethal attack in the last few years, which killed 6 people, including the antagonist, was the incel attack, involuntary celibate attack, which would normally be deemed to be a terrorist attack based on mixed or other types of leaning. That was also deemed to be driven by mental health issues, not by issues that would meet the Terrorism 2000 Act in the UK. So we're getting into many grey areas in lots of cases. It's often more clear cut, though, in the sort of jihadist Salafist area, particularly, of course, because a lot of terrorism is theatre. You need to promulgate the message, and that's why there are always these klaxon calls of "we did it" and "here's the video to show you we did it."
It's interesting because based on your conversation now about how terrorist cells work, and perhaps as lone wolf or organized, ISIS has been celebrating the massacre as a great victory, and I'm wondering to what degree they could use this as a recruiting tool to attract others to their cause.
Well, they can use it, but I think there's limited nostalgia both for AQ and for IS in terms of the way that certainly IS chose to try and promulgate its caliphate. It's the sort of why-wait notion when, in UK terms, 900 people went to the Middle East, to Syria and Iraq to fight with them, or be this part of this new city on the hill. Quite a few of them, between 20 and 40%, came back within the first year as disillusioned because it wasn't that city on the hill. And this is always the problem you have in terms of what we would call the jihadi governance dilemma, which is really what we're seeing, for example, in Idlib province at the moment with Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, where it's great being a jihadist, but providing the basics of an economy and feeding people is a different order of magnitude, and that's where we always have the dilemma of these groups, and why we probably will see some of this in the future in Afghanistan, and why the Taliban ultimately may need to be more pragmatic than they've been in the first 2 years of their governance.
You know, talking to Russian representatives to get the perspective out of Moscow, their very strong and quite repetitive narrative is that the terrorists fled towards Ukraine. So I'm wondering what basis you might see for any Russian claim that Ukraine and Western governments were involved in this plot to attack the Crocus City Hall.
Well, this is what we call narrative laundering. The Russians won't admit weakness because the Americans gave them that warning on the 7th of October, which on the 19th of October, Putin was quite vociferous in a press interview saying that these were provocative statements to intimidate and destabilize our society, and not the FSB didn't therefore take it seriously enough. Then you've got to try and change the narrative. That is that narrative laundering, because otherwise it exposes the weakness of the Russian regime when you've just, certainly in Putin terms, had a successful election between the 15th and 17th of March, where you're now Putin 5.0, supposedly at the sort of zenith of your power, can do anything you want, and suddenly you're exposed to have a weak flank. That's not good if you're an authoritarian leader. So it drives that, because the bigger driver for Russia, of course, is that they've got to keep the population on side for the war against Ukraine. And there again, you have this dichotomy when there is both a large support for the war and a large support for a peaceful negotiation. Both of those things in Russia can be true at the same time. There's that real dichotomy and paradox within Russian society.
General, do you give any credibility or see anything that warrants the speculation that perhaps this attack was engineered by Russia's leadership itself in order to bolster the Russian president, to unite the country, to create some kind of event that might take the heat off Russia in other directions?
I see no credibility in that at all. That is something which is false flag stuff just from security conspiracy theorists or Kremlin apologists. The credibility of that is extremely low.
So, final thought, Russia and Israel are both renowned for the sophistication of their intelligence and security forces, and yet both have failed to detect one of the most serious and deadly attacks on their soil in decades. How does something like that happen?
Well, I started off by saying, Riz, that the purpose of intelligence is to prevent strategic shocks. The intelligence is often there. It was there on 9/11. It wasn't joined up, which is why, for example, in American terms, they brought together a new organization, ODNI, Office of the Department of National Intelligence, to bring together all the other 17 parts of the intelligence community in America. So, of course, you provide the intelligence to a politician. They're the ones who make the decision. Ultimately, that's the dilemma, where the decision makers are politicians, not those in charge of the intelligence communities.
General, I thank you very much for your insight and look forward to speaking with you again.
Thank you, Riz.
That's it for now. I'm Riz Khan. From me and the team, thanks for watching. I'll see you soon.